Hey Mark, I wanted to make a quick video to maybe give a little insight from my experiences into something that you've been talking about lately. I think the two things I noticed you talking about were you having trouble deciding which parts of a design should be a component, and then the second issue was deciding where state should be and how to lift up state and things of that notion. So I'll try to address them as best I can with my experience, and hopefully it's helpful information to you. If not, just disregard this video. So I have an app. It's called OnePush. It is a app for writing a blog post in a single interface and then posting it to multiple places at once, like Hashnode, Dev, Medium, Ghost, right? Okay, cool. So how do I decide which parts of this interface, this design, which I know it's a basic looking design, but how do I decide which parts of the design are components? Well, the first thing to realize is that pretty much anything that's going to be contained within a div, anything that is going to be kept in a container div is probably a component. Not always, but usually it's a component. And the second thing you can think to yourself is that React always wants every component to return one element. So every component is kind of a container div in a way. It doesn't have to be a div though. This is a div, but this could be main. This could be section. Doesn't matter. But div, main, section, things like that, those are components. And so we can look at like app.js, which is where the actual final component is going to be pulled out. It's expecting one component, right? So your app is a component, right? So we have this div app container, and it contains my app. Now, what should go in this div? What should go in the app container? What should be considered the app? Well, first of all, when I was coming up with the design, I had this understanding that basically I was going to have these multiple pages and I was going to have one interface up at the top that's the same for everything. So when I'm on the right page where I write the blog, you see this, the push button, the nav bar, selected blogs. Always the same. Preview, push button, nav bar, selected blogs. Connection, same thing. So I understand that if I'm going to have an app container, it's probably always going to have these three things. Now, we've already talked about how containers can give you an idea of when something should be a component, but there's also the idea of implementation details, which is basically how does this thing work? How does it do what it does? Those are things that typically don't matter to a container. A container is just like, I'm just holding this. I don't care. I don't care what it does. I just know I am the app and I'm supposed to have a push button. I'm supposed to have a nav bar. I'm supposed to have those selected blocks, and then I'm supposed to have the page, right? I don't care how those work. I don't care what those mean. That's my job. So when you look into my app container div, right, you'll find that, well, first we have this section of code here, which says push modal active and push modal. Push modal is just this. When I press the push button, a modal pops up. Right now, since I don't have anything here, it says error, failed to submit, all that stuff, right? But when I close out of it, it leaves me alone. So we have that. And again, the implementations details of what the push modal are, like the push modal is clearly a div that contains this text, that text, and the ability to have more text, and then this close button. You don't see any of that here. You just see push modal because the app container doesn't care. It doesn't care what that is. It just knows it's supposed to have it. Then you have the push button, which is this. Again, it doesn't care, right? Now, if I show you the push modal, right, there's a lot going on here. If I show you the push button, it's just a button. This is it. Returns a button. But, again, app doesn't need to know. Doesn't care. So that gives you an indication that, okay, the implementation details don't matter, so that should probably be a component. Again, the nav bar, the push buttons here, nav bar here, nav bar here. Now the nav bar has 3 buttons. It could have 10 buttons. The app doesn't care. It just knows it has a nav bar. Blog list, set of selected blogs. I have Hashnode selected, but I could go to connections and switch and add Dev and Medium, and you see up here, it's there. Again, the app doesn't care. The app just wants to know. And then you finally have this method, show page. Now, show page is interesting. The reason that I have show page here as a method is because whenever a button is clicked on the nav bar, it has to show a different page. Again, The app container doesn't care. It just knows that it has these things here and then a page. So that's what the actual component looks like. And then at the bottom you have this span with this information. It just says, hey, hi, whatever. But again, app doesn't care. This is it. That's why these components are there. And to be honest, there's a lot of stuff in this app overall that could be broken up into components even better. The other thing that helps you decide if you should make a component or not is repeated layouts or repeated elements, right? So you can look at this, right? Post to hash node, ? With a checkbox, and then this label and then this input, right? You can imagine that's like a div. Then you have a very similar div, post to dev, label, input. Then you have a very similar div, right? So these should be components because it's repeated content. It doesn't have to be the same. And the actual specific implementation details of like, what is it posting to or whatever are, unique to each individual thing, but the layout and the structure of it is clearly the same. So you would think that being the case, that I would have broken it up into components, but I actually didn't. This is an example of how not to do React, right? I think it's good that I did it this way because then it helps you learn. Like, see, this is a div input container. It's the hash node container. You can see because it says hash node ref. It has hash node key / token, which you see over here. So it's the top one, right? Input container. Cool. Well, then we have another one, input container. So if you're seeing yourself doing this multiple times, input container, input container, input container, input container, probably these should be components. Probably. There's no reason for you to have the exact same thing with the exact same implementation details when you could write one component and just stick the information into it and have, in props and then have it generate it for you instead of writing it out manually. I did this because I was doing this in a mad dash. I think I did this project in like a week or like a week and a half or something like that. Now I want to talk about state. How do you decide where state is stored and what does lift up state mean? Now, I haven't read specific blog posts that might describe an objective definition, but my understanding of lift up state is to make sure that you define state in the highest possible place in the component hierarchy where it's going to be needed, right? Like if I go into, navbar. Now, if there's any information in these buttons that, is relevant to the app container, then the state should be in the app container because the app container is the one that needs it actually. The app container can pass it down to navbar, but navbar cannot pass anything up. You can always pass things down through props, but there's nothing that component can do to pass stuff up. Components don't actually have any direct way of altering anything above them. So navbar can't do anything directly to alter the app container. All it can do is what the app container allows it. So navbar has this prop called change page, right? It sends a method called change page. Change page does, there's some implementation details, irrelevant. The point is, in navbar, when I click on a button, eventually calls props.changePage, which brings us back here, which brings us to this method, which changes the page that's shown, which leads to us being able to see different pages, right? Cool. So let's talk about real use of passing down state and lifting up state, right? So here's some interesting stuff. When I type here, I might say follow @nightcoda1 for tech info. And then I might set a header image, right? And I might say, shout out to Mark, right? Now, all of this information is cool here, right? But if this was all stored within the page, right? For the right page, right component, it's its own component. It's a page. That's what we're looking at. You see the text area here. You see the label, blog title. All this stuff is all here. So that's what we're seeing. This is a component that we're seeing. Now, if the state was stored here, you notice there's no state here. Now, if the state was stored here, then it would be stuck here. Because like I said, you can't pass information up. But it's not stored here. It's stored in the actual index.js, the app container file. And because of that, now when I go to preview, boom, I can preview my blog post by sending data down to the preview component, which contains, I can pass it in the props. See? So I can pass it down. So basically, when I'm writing here, I'm writing to this text area. And when I write into this text area, it is setting the state of blog text right here. Const blog text equals usestate. Right. So I define it in index.js. Now, when I'm in the write component, I pass the set blog text method, the method that updates my state. I pass it down to the write component. I send a prop called update, which contains an object, which contains all of the methods necessary to set and change my state. So when you look at write, the write component, you see a text area here. This text area says, write your message for the world. Well, let's delete this. Write your message for the world. So that's the text area for the write. You notice that on change, which is the event that happens whenever you type into a text area, it calls a method. It says props.update, which remember, update is a object, .blog text. What is blog text? That's the set blog text method for my state, which I store up here. e.target.value. So I got the value of the input. Okay? New input value. Now, because that's stored here, because it's stored up here in the index.js in my app container, now if I switch my page to the preview page, I send in a prop called info, which contains a object, which contains what? The blog text, blog title, subtitle, tags. It contains my blog text though. It contains my state. So now when I go to preview and I look here, I have a span and it says, class name is text and all this stuff is just implementation details, but you can see info.blogtext. Info is the prop and I'm dereferencing it here. I instead of props, I could just easily go props instead. And then go props.info, but I'm dereferencing it. And so I have info.blogtext. What is info.blogtext? That's info is an object, blog text is my state. So when they say lift up state and where should state should go to the highest place that it's necessary. I only need blog text in the write page and in the preview page. I don't need it in the connections page because that's irrelevant. But I still need it for these two things, so I'm going to have to store it in my app container. I'm going to have to pass it up, even though my app container has other things that don't need that state. It still needs it for these two things, and so it has to have it. And so that's where my state goes. I'm sure if I went through this app, there's probably state in places that are like, there's probably some state in the connections tab or maybe in the previews tab or something that's just relevant to that. For example, if I go to the nav bar, right, this here, you notice that when I'm clicking stuff, it changes color. Well, if I go to the nav bar, I do have a state, set selected button, or selected button, and then set selected button. So when I click a button, I'm changing the state, and as a result, it ends up changing the color, the background color of the button that's chosen. So I think this kind of covers everything, and I think it's a good little talk. I hope this was what you were curious about. Otherwise, again, disregard this video. And yeah, hope this is helpful to you.